In addition to its impact on our national economy, our healthcare system, our politics, and national unity, COVID-19 has also had a dramatic impact on our churches. The weekly gathering of God's people has undergone serious shocks and, in some instances, what appear to be permanent changes in methodology and practices as a result of the pandemic. Since this has presented the church a clear health-related crisis, we thought it would be helpful to address these changes from a social, theological, and medical perspective. To do that, we're joined today by a pastor, Monte Knudsen of Faith Christian Outreach Church in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, social and political commentator Steve Deace from The Steve Deace Show on Blaze Media, and Dr. Ryan Cole, a virologist who serves as CEO and medical director of Cole Diagnostics, where he has taken and analyzed over 150,000 COVID tests. While they are important topics and of interest to many, we won't be spending time discussing the origins of the virus, vaccine efficacy, or how we should be medically treating those who have become infected with COVID, as they are not relevant to our focus today. I'd like to organize our discussion into 4 segments. What do we know, 2 years into this, about the pandemic and its danger to us? Secondly, what has the response been to the pandemic within the church community? Thirdly, how should the church respond to these kinds of events, given its call and purpose? And lastly, what have we learned, if anything, about the connection of health to our faith practices?
Well, welcome to our COVID and the Church Roundtable. So excited today to have with us Steve Deace from The Steve Deace Show, author of Faucian Bargain, and your latest book, Live What You Believe or You Won't Be Able to Believe It Much Longer, or something close to that.
Yeah, do what you believe or you won't be free to believe it much longer. Right.
Okay, well, I was close, but not quite there. Dr. Ryan Cole, MD, from Cole Diagnostics in Boise, Idaho, and Pastor Monte Knudsen from Faith Christian Outreach in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. You've been all brought here together for specific reasons, some to give social commentary, others to give a pastoral perspective, others to give specialized medical expertise. But I know that all of you have spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about, talking about, writing about the issue that we'll be looking at today. And I know that this will be something of a retrospective, because by the time people are viewing this in April, perhaps COVID will already seem like something from the past to some degree, as all of these different restrictions are falling off very quickly now. So some of our perspective today may be looking back and saying, what just happened over the last 2 years? How did this go down? How did the church respond? And do we want to go through that this way again, or can we learn something from this that will help us face the next challenge that will come our way in the church? So beginning with the question, what do we know about COVID-19 and its danger to us? I'm going to summarize what any person who's even remotely connected to the news media and social media would have heard repeatedly over the last couple of years, and that's this. COVID is a dangerous virus that hospitalized millions of Americans and killed hundreds of thousands in our country. The elderly and those with comorbidities are most at risk of hospitalization and death. Vaccines are safe, effective, and free, and are your best defense against hospitalization and death. Wearing a mask, washing your hands, socially distancing from others in public, and avoiding large gatherings are all prudent and considerate steps to protect yourself and others. The president has suggested complying with CDC directives is even our patriotic duty. Dr. Cole, I'd like to start with you. The thinking among many in the church community reflects what they have heard from the largest media sources, and that is COVID represents a grave and unprecedented risk that has to be mitigated any way possible. Recognizing that we're now dealing with a third variant, with each variant possessing unique characteristics, in your opinion, how dangerous is COVID, and who needs to be especially concerned with contracting this virus?
I think the good news now is that what we're dealing with in Omicron is we've gone from COVID being a tiger to COVID being a kitty cat. So when we look at the amount of change that we've seen in this recent last couple of months, it's been a blessing to humanity. Now, does that mean that there are people still not at risk? Absolutely not. The earlier variants, certainly they had their targeted populations and populace, which were at highest risk, as you already mentioned, and that was the elderly, the comorbid, those with underlying conditions. As we look back now and we can take a collective sigh, we can say we've moved on from that. It is very unfortunate that governmentally we had approaches that were very restrictive. We had government protocols in hospitals that were actually, in my opinion, very deadly and weren't very forward-thinking in the way that we approached medicine. We had so many doctors around this country that had the ability to treat this disease early and had phenomenal success doing so, and were very restricted in trying to get those early life-saving treatments to patients. And to this day, those protocols from the NIH are still present in the hospital, and they haven't varied. They're underdosed steroids, underdosed anti-clotting regimes. We are really looking at the aftermath of bad governmental decision making. And going forward, we, I think, need to remember what happened here. And number one, we should let doctors be doctors. Shackling the hands of those who know the patient best, know the way to intervene with those patients isn't the way, to fix a fast-spreading virus. Is everybody at equal risk? No. 85% of the deaths and adverse outcomes were in patients age 75 and older, and we treated an entire populace as though they were all the same, which was very unfortunate. So I think looking forward, we need to not put our trust in the hand of man. I think, this being a religious circle, a spiritual circle, we need to look to a higher power, and we don't need science to come from people that declare themselves gods. That's the very unfortunate look back in all of this. There was that declarative statement that we are the science, trust us. And sadly, things went so badly because of that. And I can expound in further questions as we go forward. We're back down to pre-December levels now in terms of where Omicron burned through. We got natural immunity from that quick burn through of the Omicron virus. We have so many people now that are COVID recovered, have natural immunity for a lifetime based on studies from SARS-CoV-1. We're in a good place now, but I think we have lots of lessons to be learned from how we were treated, how the church is overall around the world was treated, especially here in this supposed free country. We lost so many of those rights, so many of those privileges, so many things that did not need to happen.
Well, Steve, the various vaccines and boosters have been marketed as safe and effective. Masking has been universally encouraged and often required. To even question this over the past 18 months has meant censoring and cancellation on social media and disrepute in the medical community. In this first segment, we're trying to determine the danger the COVID virus poses to the church community. Vaccines and masking have been presented as the best way to assure we can congregate safely. You've looked at the data surrounding these protocols as much as anyone in our country. What have you discovered?
The ruination of Western epistemology is a far bigger threat to the American church than COVID. That's what I've discovered. The inability to understand what makes something true, to verify whether it's true, to critically think, to discern, to the amount of figures and people within the church that I have seen just take the expertise fallacy or the non-falsifiable, verifiable fallacy. Well, it could be even worse if we didn't do these things. How would we know? These are really non-critical thinking, emotion-driven, sort of postmodern. I wouldn't even call it pagan. Pagans at least have some form of critical thinking. They've just come to the wrong critical conclusions. This is just absent of thinking. You could at least debate a druid. I don't know how you debate Chicken Little. And that's essentially what has what you've seen overcome much of the country. And unfortunately, at a time when the church should have shined brightly as a lighthouse, as a beacon for critical thinking and for accurate knowledge. Instead, a lot of churches just went ahead and surrendered to the state and said, hey, you guys go ahead and let us know when it's okay to preach again. Somewhere John Bunyan is rolling over in his grave. I should have just said that to the King of England. I could have written Pilgrim's Progress for 16 years, in peace and tranquility, and not with, rocks that I wrote on a prison cell. And so when you look at actual data, literally none of those things are true. When you look at actual data, I mean, the vaccine data is so bad that our own CDC recently told the New York Times it doesn't want to really even report true stratified data on vaccines as it relates to outcomes with hospitalizations and severe illness, because frankly, if you looked at the actual data, it might lend people to come to the conclusion that they don't work. The Public Health Department in Scotland recently said the same thing. They were going to stop reporting the actual stratified data because they didn't want to fuel a narrative that Pfizer and Moderna might not be Jesus. And Israel stopped providing this kind of data months ago when we saw during the Delta wave that the vaccines were collapsing there. I mean, Israel is one of the most jabbed countries on earth. I don't call them vaccines because by any definition of the term vaccine that we had in our country prior to COVID, they do not meet the threshold. Even during Delta, back on August 6th, Rochelle Walensky, head of the CDC, admitted on CNN that they don't stop you from getting infected under Delta. They completely fell apart in that regards under Omicron. So, I mean, imagine somebody said, I got a really good method of birth control and it didn't work. I'm pregnant, but it's okay because had I not taken this, I would have had triplets. That's essentially the messaging that we have adopted and utilized for these jabs without even considering what the long-term ramifications of injecting this new technology into our bodies happens to be. And that's, to me, one of the great tragedies of this, David, is that this really should have been a time that brought us all together. Now, this should have been a time for maximum grace and empathy, because we don't know all of us are lab rats. Every single one of us are. We don't know the long-term ramifications of being exposed to a virus of questionable to malicious origin that is aerosolized and airborne. So we've all been exposed to it, even if it was asymptomatic. We don't know what the long-term ramifications are of that to your physiology. Similarly, we don't know what we've done to your immunology with injecting you into this technology that as recent as 2008, there was no serious investment in, or nobody saw any real scientific promise with. As recently as 2019, Moderna was rejected for the 8th time in attempting to bring one of these mRNA products to market unsuccessfully. And yet we've injected over, at the time of we're recording this, 550 million plus doses of this into Americans, over about 6 billion doses of this into people worldwide. We don't know the long-term ramifications of that either for a virus that right at the time we're taping this has a 1.1% CFR, hardly Ebola. So with everybody taking a long-term risk here, this should have been a time for maximum grace and empathy. Instead, it got more divisive, particularly where masks came along. The more and more real-time data showed they didn't work, the more divisive and angry that topic got, which shows you that really they were a totem, they were an idol, sort of a spirit of the age, religious relic. This is how I show that, I can't go down in the valley of Ben Hinnom and throw my babies into the fire to Moloch anymore, but, I can put a mask on my baby and choke him out to show that I'm down with the struggle. And so a lot of this really was performance theater, the kind of stuff you do see with pagan religions. And this really should have been a moment that the church really could have shined brightest in contrast, but instead that much of the church went dark.
Well, you have thought about this, and you have a message for the church. Pastor Monte, as a pastor, how do you receive that for the first time in our country's history? The element of danger has been a part of the calculations for our congregations, though some might argue that isolated church service shootings have done this as well. Have you seen that challenge handled? How have you seen that challenge handled by various churches? And what do you think about the idea that attending church services and activities should be a risk-free scenario? Is it the church's responsibility to assure safety from illness as a primary value?
Well, no, David, it's not. And when you look at church history, I mean, they gathered in all kinds of different various situations, whether it was pressure from governments. In Acts chapter 2, they gathered together even though they were being threatened and persecuted. They came out boldly, asking God to give them boldness to speak his name boldly. When they were threatened by Pharisees, religious rulers, not to speak or teach this name of Jesus. They came back to their own company again and prayed together. They gathered together. So this idea of religious freedom, of course, is top notch in America. It's not true around the world. And as Americans, we really let go of that religious freedom as a church and kowtowed to government mandates. Mm-hmm. And maybe partially because we just didn't know what to think about how dangerous the virus may be. And so we listened to the voices that were there and took their recommendations, and people shut down their churches everywhere. But it wasn't long, I didn't think, until there was all kinds of controversy around that whole mandate. Who was allowed to stay open? Of course, people were allowed to stay open who the government said was mandatory, which not only included big box stores, but also included pornography issues or even strip clubs or bars. Mm-hmm. And the church was silent on that issue, except for a few who made public news when they sued or just continued to gather against it. And then were sued by their own state and had to either make a decision they were going to spend millions of dollars in defending that right, or actually, again, bow down to the idol of government. So I think Steve is right when he said the church could have really shined in this moment of a health, quote, crisis, because the church has always been the first to develop hospitals in history, to develop care for the sick. The Bible is always taught to, what's the word I want to say, isolate the sick, but we intend isolated healthy people, which had never been done before in the history of mankind. So the church really failed, I think, in its mission of standing up for Christ-honoring ideas and gathering together to say, we care for the world more than anyone by the love of Jesus Christ, and we want to keep people whole.
I think that's an interesting perspective, Monte, about how the church was at the forefront of so many medical things, as far as hospitals founding and all that. It's interesting that a lot of the doctors and nurses and scientists that were going around, like you're seeing and doing right now, Dr. Cole, it wasn't churches sponsoring those that I'm aware of. It was other groups that were sponsoring those, and maybe that was a missed opportunity for the church to take leadership, as it historically has in some of these kind of things. The church has responded to the COVID pandemic in a variety of ways. Some complied with local mask mandates or shutdowns only as long as mandated. Others continued these practices even after mandates ended. Most have expanded their online experience so people can worship from home. Some have even begun segregating their congregants into mask and no mask and vaccinated, unvaccinated categories, with people being segregated and worshiping in different spaces. Notable Christian thought leaders, some of whom I respect, have blogged and spoken on the issue. Some influential churches, Christian leaders, and publications have given a platform to government proponents of vaccines and shutdowns. Steve and Pastor Monte, how do these responses relate to the call and purpose of the church? And what are your thoughts on these responses? Can you give us any idea what has happened to churches based on their particular responses?
Well, I can speak to that, at least in my limited resources of, churches, especially in Iowa or even the United States, and even in some around the world with our missions outreach that we have literally around the world. There's still a lot of churches that are shut down around the world. And of course, they don't have religious freedom. So they've been made to isolate. They can't reach their people. They can't minister effectively to their people. This is the same thing is true in the United States. Many churches have finally opened up, but with great reserve. As you mentioned, sometimes with masks, sometimes with masks. They're isolating their people. They're creating divisions within the church. The Bible speaks a lot about the gathering of believers, not just Hebrews chapter 10, where it talks about don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together, but also Matthew chapter 18, where Jesus said, if just 2 of you or 3 of you will gather together in my name, I'm in your midst. There's a powerful principle of gathering together in the Bible concerning Psalm 86, where the Bible says, even all nations shall gather together and worship the Lord. So this idea of, when we went to the governor here of our own state in Iowa, we said, this is really going against religious freedom. If you're going to trust big box stores to be open to serve people, who more should you trust than the Church of Jesus Christ to minister to people. And she thankfully was agreeable to that idea and said, you're right. I'm not going to stop the church from gathering. I'm going to trust your judgment about how to stay safe. I was disappointed as a religious leader, as a minister, of how little the church took in this leadership idea of saying, how do we really gather and keep people safe? And part of the reason was that because what I was seeing from a personal standpoint is all you had to do was follow the money. The money governed everything about our health. So wherever money poured in, that's where the health practice took part. So, and it was about, paying hospitals for getting people on aspirators. It was about paying people for admitting them into hospitals. Quote, hospitals were full, but they weren't full. They were full only to the capacity of taking care of, quote, people coming down with COVID. I talked to people directly who had gone to get tested for COVID and then decided, I'm not going to stand in this line forever. And then they get an email later and say, I did test positive for COVID and no one ever tested me. So I knew already that there was corruption in this whole medical system about how we were trying to actually keep people safe, which concerned me, obviously, as a believer in Jesus Christ, because isn't that the way world history has worked against the Church of Jesus Christ, to control it, lie to it, feed it information that wasn't so, that kept the church at bay, told people that they should be afraid of things that they shouldn't be afraid of. So, we opened our church as quickly as possible. Within 3 weeks after the government asked us to carefully and thoughtfully shut down, 3 weeks later, we were open, and we just did things that we've always done to be safe. We asked people to wash their hands. We put disinfectant around our building. We spread out our facility a little bit, because at that time information was, it's fairly contagious within a very short distance. So we asked people just to separate. But then we also prayed for the sick. We ministered to people that were at home and sick, and we took them food and helped in our community. And many churches around the state of Iowa actually did that, as well as around the nation. But the fear that overwhelmed people, and it still is there today because it was talked about so often, so negatively, so in false information, that fear just tended to grip everyone until, it's like, if you're going to die driving a car and you hear it every day, well, you just stop driving a car, whether you're going to be safe or not. And that was what was happening really with people, at least in my dimension of influence, that I saw within the churches of Iowa and literally across our nation.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great answer, Monte. I'm going to try to answer this as non-angrily, David, as I can, because
Please.
over the last 23 months, I have been inundated with emails from brokenhearted people, people who they lost a loved one who committed suicide because their AA or Celebrate Recovery group connected to their church wasn't there for them anymore, and they fell off the wagon and were broken and collapsed, and they're dead now. People who have lost family members who have shunned them, and there's no one to reach out to them, and their church community was doing that for them and no longer did. Their church won't reopen. Their church was the one thing, the one bedrock they had, and now they can't count on that. I cannot tell you how many of those emails I have received, and you can be as calloused as I am, but after a while, man, your defenses break down and it starts rubbing you raw, and you're like, someone needs to pay for this. Okay, so I'm gonna try to remove as much of my own emotion as I can, and look at it more from a worldview standpoint. If I just take a step back, I think there are two worldview issues that I have seen in the American church at play here. One is a misunderstanding of Romans 13, and there's two parts of that misunderstanding. The first part is even in the words Paul actually writes. One of the closing statements he says there is to give honor to whom honor is given. Now, what does that, or honor is owed, I should say. Give honor to whom honor is owed. Now, what does that mean? Well, we know what Paul meant by the way he lived it out. He clearly did not mean this was really just an unconditional social transaction between state and church. Otherwise, he'd have kept his head, and Nero would have viewed him as a member of Rome in good standing. So clearly there are some limits somewhere, that there is an honor the state can claim that they are not owed. And the fact that so few churches were even willing to even have this conversation I mean, how long does this go on? You tell us how much longer. You show us what are the safety protocol achievements that we are looking to reach as a community. What are those benchmarks? What are the metrics? So few even bother to even ask these questions. The second part of it is the idea that we live in America with rulers. We do not. The first words of this country's government is "we the people" in order to form a more perfect union. In this country, when it says respect your earthly rulers, they have to respect us. We are the earthly rulers here. We are the government. We are those who consent to being governed by them. We vote for them. We fund them. All of this is a voluntary social compact, and we're armed, which means we can end that voluntary aspect of the social compact anytime we'd like. So this is an inverted paradigm. We don't have Caesars. We have public servants. And so this idea that we're to be good citizens here by being obedient to government, no, we're not. We're to be obedient to God. And then our government is to protect our God-given rights. And then when it does not, we are to hold it accountable, for it is in default. So there are two things with Romans 13 that either are just not taught or mistaught, in my view, in American churches. The other part of it is a little bit more touchy, the second aspect of this. And a lot of this has really cropped up even more since the emergence of Trump. And I just can't answer your question without going there, and I'm sorry. Okay, there is a notion, and you know, I see this a lot with Gen Xers, and that's what I am. You know, we're taking the place now of the boomers in the pulpits, and a lot of Gen Xer pastors don't want to be mascots for the Republican Party. They just viewed that it didn't. What did it accomplish for the Pat Robertsons and the D. James Kennedys and the Jerry Falwells of the world? And now we have a party that we are sold out to, and it hates us. And I think you know me well enough to know, Dave, I'm fairly sympathetic to that view. Okay, but we can't exchange one false choice for another. And I think what we have found since Trump's emergence is that those who were really concerned with his behavior and his morals and staining the church and its witness with it, really concerned, is about this big. And those who use that as an excuse to say, we're actually here to be simps for the spirit of the age and the other's team, is about this big. All right. In other words, what we call the false objection. Very few people really were concerned about Trump's behavior. They were more concerned about using this to say, and this is why we all need to be Jim Wallace's and Ron Siders now and Tony Campolo's now. We need to be mascots for the Democratic Party. We need the church to relook at gender roles. All the world is Jen Hatmaker and Beth Moore now. And I think that notion permeated a lot of these churches that were then completely comfortable with shutting down, completely comfortable with assuming the position for the state, completely comfortable with doing whatever the state said and instituting and installing all of its methods and procedures because they had already made the determination, David, to insert the state's ideology and theology into their pulpits as it is. So this was just the next logical extension of that. And that needs to be said, and that needs to be called out. Because that cancer, that tumor in the church is long going to outlast these mask and jab mandates and needs to be confronted. Because the next time the state comes along and says, hey, we've got an offer you can't refuse, those are the same people no matter what it is, and the same churches no matter what it is, who will try to use people like Trump, whoever the next problematic figure is, as a deflection in order to cover the fact that really they just want to bow the knee to the spirit of the age.
Steve brushed against the reality, Dr. Cole, of those who were experiencing difficulty getting to their AA groups and the calamity that came in their own life. Can you highlight, put any more meat on that bone about some of the things we don't realize that were effects of the lockdowns and not meeting together regarding the depression or suicide or drug abuse or some of the kind of things we've heard about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we've had record drug overdose deaths, over 100,000 this year, exceeding all records in previous years. The CDC is usually a year behind on suicide data. But we know certain school districts had to open back up, like in Las Vegas, because the suicide rate within children was so high that, again, the cure was worse than the disease itself. And so tragically across society, we let this supposed cure, these masks, these lockdowns, these separations of communities of people supersede what matters most, and that's connection and community. And so we've seen this vast disease of depression, of loss, of addiction, of suicide, and we're going to pay that price for years to come. And I agree with Pastor Monte, the concept of fear. I mean, false expectations accepted as real. And we lost trust in public health. That was one of the great deaths of this past 2 years. Public health is someone who we should have trusted, and we prop them up on a pulpit as a false god, and we followed their edicts, even though their edicts weren't based in science. It was based in lies. And I call a lie a limited idea entertained. And so we entertained these limited ideas from these false gods, these false leaders, these false constructs. And to Steve's point, not only are we going to see physical cancers going forward from what we've done, with experimental shots, we're going to see a cancer of the soul and of the spirit in these communities of faith. We need to regain that construct. A pandemic isn't in the Constitution. It doesn't say your constitutional rights all go away because it's a pandemic. And so all of these adverse effects that we've seen societally are going to linger for years. And again, it's people of faith, people of community that are going to have to go in and patch those wounds and resurrect the spirit and the soul of these people who have been so harmed by this. Certainly the medical damage has been done. So many lives were lost that we could have saved had we not been restricted by the government. But these extraordinary events beyond just the disease itself are really one of the heartbreaking tragedies of this entire process.
Dave, can I add something really quick to what he just said?
Sure.
My wife is a therapist at Heartland Christian Counseling. They're one of the larger Christian counseling centers here in Des Moines. They are so overloaded with children to treat for depression, problem solving. I mean, they're just behind. They're stunted in their development. That they have to turn kids away. They don't have enough counselors, even in an audience in an office of that size, to meet the demand, even in a mid-sized city like Des Moines. I cannot even imagine what is going on in much bigger population sectors around the country.
Yeah. Certainly the church will find itself needing to respond to the after effects of this for many years to come. Kids who aren't comprehending or whose speech isn't working right or are acting up because of all of the masking in schools and the developmental stagnation there. People who weren't getting a great education while they were coming online and just phoning in their school experience, along with all these other things. It'll be interesting to see how the church responds to these new needs in the years to come. Well, Steve and Monte, a common rationale for taking all reasonable precautions has been that keeping people safe is a practical demonstration of love and concern for them. The idea is that if we purport to really love people, we will do everything we can to protect them and make them feel comfortable. For example, somebody might personally be skeptical that masks prevent the spread of the virus, but know that others in the congregation believe that they do. So they wear a mask out of concern that others are feeling comfortable and safe. Is meeting remotely, spacing rows out more, not physically touching others, and wearing masks the loving thing to do, even if we have differing views on mask efficacy, etc.? Could this even be said to be helping a weaker brother?
Well, you can twist scripture to however you'd like to twist it to get to wherever your feelings or emotions want to go. But scripturally, you can't do it because the Bible tells us God's not given us a spirit of fear. And whenever God tells us to do something in our obedience to him, there's always going to be a fear in that obedience, whether it's going into a promised land and taking care of Canaanites and Amorites and chasing them out and saying, oh, we're not going to go in lest all of our children be killed. And then we're never going to have a land and all our children will become slaves again. That fear is what governs that. So when you boil it down to safety alone, you won't do anything. You'll hide out. You'll isolate yourself, no matter what that fear is of it, was fear of giants or fear of mask or fear of a pandemic or fear of going on a train ride or a plane ride. You can never eliminate all risk. So, I think about when I was in Poland, we gathered there together around the church that had been built when communism came over after World War II, and we left. And the believers came to gather at the church, but the communists burned it down, because the idea of the church existing was an affront to communism and an affront to their government ideology. So they just burned it down. So believers would gather there in the burnt ruins and take part of the iron that had come from the building, and they built a cross with it, and that's where they gathered, David, and they'd worship God. Was there a risk in it? Yeah. Was the pastor not thinking about their safety, because the communists might come out? And they did. They came out and they beat them. They took them in jail. They threw their cross away, and they go find that cross in a ditch somewhere, and they put it back up, and they gather, whether it was winter or summer, and there was always a risk in it. In the Black Plague, bubonic plague that took, ruined 30 million some people's lives. It was the church that stood up and said, we've got to find a way to minister to the sick. They didn't go hide out afraid of the bubonic plague. They didn't even know what caused it or how it was affected people. In fact, that's where the Passover in Germany originated from. They said, we have to find a way to reach people. And they started the Passion Play back in I think the 4th century. It's been going ever since. This was the first year
or whatever.
Yep. Yeah. It's the first year it's been canceled because of COVID since the bubonic plague. And it originated out of the bubonic plague to gather people together to honor Christ and trust him for his safe and healthy. Yet it was shut down because of COVID. I think this whole idea of eliminating risk is a false anomaly. And the moment that the church is trying to eliminate all risk in people's lives, you've just lost the courage of Jesus Christ. And I think this is why God said to Moses, you've got to be courageous and trust me. And I think courage is a big part of the church. So if you're trying to eliminate risk, that's just like saying if you go to a church, your child might get molested. Well, you know what? We've done everything we can. We do background checks. We make sure that we look at people before they're over childcare. So we do our best in that effort to say we want to minister life and health to people. But there's a risk that your child could be molested at a church. It's also a risk that your child could be molested at a Walmart, or they could be molested at your school with a teacher. So you can never eliminate all this risk. So this idea of saying, boy, if you don't wear a mask, you're creating a risk for the rest of us, and that's not loving. That's just really a doctrine of demons. That's the spirit of fear to control people. And the Bible talks about in the last days specifically, these doctrines will be everywhere that create a fear. So Paul tells Timothy, don't believe that God has given you a spirit of fear, but one of love and power and a reasoning or sound mind. So I think that whole dynamic of theology to try to keep people safe really is hurtful to people instead of helpful to people, because it's based on the spirit of fear, not on faith in Jesus Christ.
That's a great answer. Difficult to follow. I'll do my best. Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is just like it. Yeah. To love your neighbor as you love yourself. So these are the two most important, but they are put in a certain order. It is more important first to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, because it is out of that love, it is out of that community restored with your Creator that you will understand and then even be capable to love your neighbor as you love yourself. It's not on an equal footing. It's not ahead of loving God. So, for example, when Paul is ironing out matters of conscience, which you just alluded to in your question, right? So like meat sacrificed to idols. And he says, hey, if some person understands that, hey, that meat is, it's to a false or fake God, and it's just meat and they're hungry and they want to eat it, that's fine. If someone else's conscience is penetrated because they come out of that kind of a religious setting and they're adamantly against it, that's fine too, okay? So this really comes down, though, that question comes down to, in both cases, both sides of that equation are recognizing that is not God. That is not a true thing. That's not a true thing. And the matter and the empathy and the grace comes from that first initial recognition of a truth statement. We start with a truth. In this case, what you are asking me to do is violate the commandment against bearing false witness in order to accommodate you. So this is very similar to someone going to Pastor Monte and saying, you know what, you preached on gender identity and sexuality, and I have different views of that, and that made me feel unsafe. Will you change your sermon in order to accommodate me? I mean, after all, love your neighbor as you love yourself. So do I have to disobey God to accommodate you? If the answer is yes, then my answer to you is no. All right. We fear God and not man. All right. I mean, if we could get away with accommodating people and denying God, we have a lot fewer martyrs, folks. Okay. So you're asking me to recognize something that is a false construct of salvation. You're asking me, you're telling me now, this is different than I'm not going to eat the meat because I recognize it's bad, and you're eating the meat because you know it's bad, but therefore you don't think it makes a difference. You're now telling me that this always works one way, right? I now have to cross over to your way. It's one thing for me to say, I'm not going to make you cross over to mine, but now you're telling me I have to cross over to you. That's authoritarianism. That's not empathy. That's not grace. And that's what affirmation asks for. Affirmation and mercy and grace are not the same thing. Affirmation is often tied to a form of authoritarianism. Affirm and recognize I am the authority. What I believe is the authority, and affirm me. And if there's one thing we all certainly are not here to do, Jesus said, do not think I came to bring peace, but a sword. I'll pit even mother against daughter, because really the ultimate argument here, the first thing God says to Adam is, I've given you dominion. You have dominion. Name the animals, procreate, subdue the earth. You are my representative on earth. He sins, of course, which requires a second Adam. And then after that second Adam rolls the stone away and conquers death, he says in the book of Revelation, I am the ruler of God's creation. He says to his apostles, all authority has been granted unto me. See, all of these arguments we've been having for the last few thousand years are really an argument about dominion. Who's really in charge of us and who is in charge down here? All of the arguments are about dominion. That's really the Protestant Reformation. That was an argument about dominion. Is the Bible the supreme law, or what the church and its officials say, the supreme law and interpretation? It's all a matter of dominion. For us as believers, our dominion is in Christ. Anything you ask me to do that does not violate my dominion in Christ, then I will bend over backwards to do for you. But the minute you ask me to violate that dominion to serve another dominion, my answer has to be no. And that's what went on here. Is we were not asked to accommodate. If you feel better wearing your silly little mask, go ahead. I wouldn't do it, but go ahead. Doesn't bother me any. But now you're telling me that I'm a terrible person if I don't engage in the same silliness as you. That grace and mercy has to work both ways, David. And if it doesn't work both ways, it's many, many things, but it's not grace and mercy.
Yeah, as a former pastor, and Monte and anybody who's a believer knows that helping to perpetuate fear and falsehood with other people isn't particularly a loving thing to do.
No, exactly right.
So if we're convinced in our own minds that something we're being asked to do in lockstep with society, whatever it is something that is actually going to harm or perpetuate falsehoods, it may not be the loving thing to go along to get along and perpetuate falsehoods. The best thing is to tell the truth and try to have truth on your side and present the data that would expose it if it is false. Well, one argument that is used a lot is the idea that saving even one life makes inconveniences and new church methodologies worth the effort. After all, the church should be pro-life all the way if it's really committed to that value. What would you say to the pastor espousing that seemingly indisputable logic? I'm interested in any of your responses.
I'll chime in real quick. I mean, in medicine, obviously, that's an oath we take. We're here to save a life. This whole construct that we're discussing of safetyism is a false construct. Life isn't safe. Any medical procedure isn't safe. And we've put our trust into the hand of man, and a lot of doctors think MD means minor deity. It should mean make a difference. And so, in terms of just, finding that doctor that says, look, nothing I do is safe, and I am going to try to help you. It's the soul of one. It's we're certainly the 99, but we're going after the one to try to save that one. And so this concept in medicine, at the very least, from this bigger point that you're bringing up, absolutely that one matters. But I think that one also has to want to help themselves. So I can give all the medical advice in the world, and if somebody is not willing to do the things to help their body get better, it won't make a whit of difference. And so I think it's personal responsibility combined with those that are reaching out to help. So there's, it's an interesting dichotomy at the very least. But yes, I took an oath to save that life. But I don't want to be hindered by external forces, governmental forces, regulators saying this is the only way you can save this life. That's not what scripture teaches us. That's not what prophecy teaches us. And the false prophets that have arisen within the church is saying, oh, you will do this, because the government says so, instead of saying, I have the spirit of prophecy, and I know this is going to be bad for you, this is going to be bad for you, this is going to be bad for you. And we have that spirit of discernment. We should be able to use both as physicians, as pastors, as parishioners, to all be able to say, look, I'm going to take personal responsibility in addition to helping others, being the Good Samaritan in the entire process, but at the same time, not acquiescing to, again, I think this overarching theme that we're discussing of fear on top of it all. So that's kind of my 2 cents worth on that topic.
Okay.
I think that's really good.
More of the personal responsibility part here as we conclude in a little bit, but go ahead, Pastor Knudsen.
Well, I was going to affirm Dr. Cole's remarks on that idea, because when we try to become affirming to everyone's dynamic of whatever they're governing their life, the idea is tolerance. And that's a big, really, spirit of deceit in America today, that we must be tolerant of all ideas except the ideas of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. The ideas of Jesus Christ are narrow, right? They're a small gate to walk through. I remember as a sophomore in high school, I was having a debate with my teacher on the history of Nazism, and he said to me when we were talking about it, he says, Monty, your problem is you're too narrow. You have only one idea, and that's a godly idea. And I said, you're right. It is a narrow idea. I said, because Jesus Christ said the way to him is narrow. And I think, when it comes to this spirit of tolerance, of the idea, every believer, every Christian wants to be loving because our God is loving. But God is not tolerant of all ideas. And there are many things that, because he's not tolerant of them, he punishes or he disciplines. He even disciplines believers of ideas that are contrary to him. So when we come to this idea of using this mask mandate that we should be tolerant, we're really falling into a deceitful message of saying that we should tolerate anything that, quote, the government says is safe. And there are a lot of things that aren't safe to us that the government would mandate, starting with money, how they handle our finances and the taxation. There are numerous things that are not safe about that. So why should we be tolerant of it? Or why should we be tolerant of certain health practices when the government itself cannot have the same message on point? They say one thing one week, another thing another week, and we say, well, which is lie and which is truth? Why do we go to our medical community and we say, I don't like your diagnosis, I'm going to get a second opinion? Because we're not just tolerant of one opinion. We want to find out, is there more to this than meets the eye? This is the idea of when the church becomes tolerant of all these government mandates in the name of love, we're not being tolerant in the name of love. We're being tolerant in the name of authoritarianism. And what Steve mentioned is another dominion. It's not the dominion of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to wipe away that tolerant ideology in the church, because otherwise we become tolerant of, quote, homosexuality, tolerant of transgenderism, tolerant of men and women's bathrooms. And we become tolerant of all in the name of love, but there's nothing loving about it. In fact, it's sinful. So using that argument of tolerancy for the mask mandates is really another way to say you're just being sinful in your approach to how you're dealing with that.
Steve, there's nobody more pro-life than you. You've been an advocate for pro-life for a long time. When somebody says, well, Steve, you're a big pro-life advocate. If we can just save one life by shutting the church down for several months, why aren't you jumping on board with that? What would your response be to that?
My response would be, have you asked to see, are we doing all the treatments we could do to save as many people as we possibly could? Because we have not. We just haven't. I mean, I can't even, I would calculate it's probably Peter McCullough is arguably the most decorated cardiologist in American history. At least he was pre-COVID. I mean, now, of course, he might as well just name himself Donald Trump for daring to actually follow science. But I mean, he's done the math. He thinks probably about 80% of the deaths that we've seen in America were preventable with early onset treatments. I mean, Ryan, I know you've had a couple of bouts with COVID and taken them. I have too, and taken them. I've seen over 60 studies that have shown that these medications work as an early prophylaxis. I've seen plenty of real-time data in my own audience and personal life that they do as well. And yet, where's the huge advocacy for that? See, this is where we have to be. And this is, I guess, if I had a final point, David, it's where is the consistency? I look at the church we attend, Valley Church here in West Des Moines. And they opened up as fast as they possibly could. They also, though, did it very modestly, very small gatherings at first, little by little. And it was not at the fast pace that I would have done it. But you know what? I was totally fine with it. I wasn't going to be divisive about it. Why? Because their motivation was to get us back to normal at some point. We were accomplishing benchmarks for a large congregation to maintain unity. So even if I disagreed with some of the decisions, I appreciated the motivations, and that was more important to me, which was to restore us, to make us whole again, to get us there. Mm-hmm. These questions that are often asked, though, have no metrics behind them. They have no conclusion behind them. They're just empty sentimentality and emotions. And so, I mean, ultimately, first of all, when Jesus leaves 99 behind for the one lost sheep, it costs him his life. The idea that you're going to save anyone with no risk at all, the disciples, it cost all of them their lives, okay? So the idea of saving people without any risk just isn't a biblical construct and concept to begin with. But secondly, where's the consistency? Where's the demand that, we provide the treatments and medications available to people that it would actually work? Where is this idea that I can save people by not risking anything? These are, Ryan used a great term earlier, safetyism. These are a lot of different isms, but they are not of a biblical worldview. Luther actually wrote correspondence letters demanding and commanding that believers during the plague not leave their posts, for they should know that their eternity is in another life, in another kingdom other than this one, and should be perfectly fine with sacrificing their early lives in order to bring the gospel to as many sick people as he possibly could while those people were still alive and breathing. So this idea that there's a Christianity devoid of risk, I would say the cross begs to differ.
Let's wrap things up with a look at this issue that, for me, as one who is trying to develop a biblical and gospel-centered fitness ministry to the church, I look at how over the last couple of years, suddenly the church has gotten really interested in people's health and has shut down stuff and completely reoriented everything out of a desperate concern for people's health. And I scratch my head and say, since when did the church care about people's health? So now that the church really cares about people's health, all of you might have a perspective, both from a medical end to a social commentary end to a pastoral end. Now that the church is really concerned about people's health, how do we keep paying this forward? And where do we start looking, since health is such a big value in the church now? He said with his tongue firmly planted in his cheek.
I like to joke, never trust a physician who's obese, who smokes, and whose plants are dead. So first, physician, heal thyself. So first, you have to find a physician that believes in health. And I think that's critical in terms of just an example of wellness. But our body is a temple. And do we treat it as such? You know, we wouldn't desecrate a house of God. Do we desecrate this brief bodily temple we're gifted with? And so this whole construct of health, I've looked at that for many years in this construct. What am I going to allow into the temple? And is it holy or isn't it? You know, how close to nature are we living? You know, God provided those beautiful animals and plants for us to consume. Are we going to the gods of consumerism and process this, that, and the other? Are we sedentary and not moving, you know, this body that we're given? You know, think of the early disciples and all the miles they walked preaching. You know, they were using their body for good. So we're given a gift of a body. Are we treating it as a gift, or are we treating it as, you know, something that we deserve? Or are we in this entitlement position? And I think sometimes how we treat our own body reflects upon how we truly view the gift that it is. So that's just kind of an overall view in terms of the health and wellness. And so much of what we've experienced in this past year or two could have been averted if we were in that position. We as a nation did quite a bit worse than other nations that do focus a little more on health. And so, you know, are we getting the sleep we need? Are we eating the things we should, or are we eating the things we shouldn't? Are we taking our vitamin D? The most simple thing of all, that message that kept getting suppressed by our public health services. It's just so surprising how many simple things we can do going forward for any illness, and to prevent so many. You know, I want to live old young. I think most of us do. We want to enjoy this body, this temple, as long as we can, but in a way that's productive. You know, how do we give back to the congregation, to the church, to our fellow citizens of this beautiful planet? And that's only if we're of healthy body and healthy mind. And so we need to treat ourselves in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Maybe
Just like anything, if you address obesity, it's offensive to people who are overweight or who have poor diet or struggle in their life with metabolism. Their metabolism is low and difficult. And so, you know, as a minister, if you address obesity, you're going to offend people. And the same thing was true when it came to COVID. If you're going to address health and natural immunity and encourage people, listen, you need to do something better about your immune system. The way that you're eating is not building your immune system. You're not giving the nutrients your body needed. In fact, it's one of the things that I really sat down with my staff and said, listen, you know, most of you are in pretty good shape, but most of you don't realize how poor your immune systems are by the foods that you eat. So you need to start taking some extra vitamins, things that you're not getting through your nutrition, to build up your immunity system. And some of my own staff was kind of like, well, gee, you know, what kind of a, you know, leader are you? You know, so you always take the risk of, you know, in dealing with just sexual practices. Aren't there healthy sexual practices and unhealthy sexual practice? So if you deal with that from a health perspective, you're going to offend people who are living unhealthy in their sexual practices. So I think that's really the great, what do I want to say? The great challenge of the church, of believers in Jesus Christ in the pulpits of America, is to, again, have people who in our pulpits who don't fear man, but fear only God, and are willing to deal with the things that God talks about our health, both physically, emotionally, certainly spiritually. And if we're afraid to do that because we're going to create division, well, then I think we fear man more than we fear God.
I love this question because it's framed in the way of fleshing out a false objection and a fallacy, and to see how serious people really are about their own talking points. And, you know, my history, David, I was over 400 pounds. Okay. So I have fought the battle of the bulge, particularly over the last 10 years. I'm still too pudgy, and I've also lost well over 100 pounds. So I see both sides of the argument because I've lived on both ends of it, and I'm sympathetic to it. But this is where the whole thing about love comes in. What is it? And I think a lot of times, you know, we like to say that God is love, but love is not God. God determines what love is. And so when he scolds us, if God is love, the scolding is loving. The discipline, the Lord chastens or disciplines those whom he loves. And I think that we've got to get back to the idea that love is not an intention. You know, I can intend to do all kinds of good things, and then, you know, bankrupt your treasury and your business out of good intentions. Love is not a sentiment or a tone. The same Paul who says to use words of love seasoned with salt also looks at the sorcerer and calls him in full public view a son of the devil. Okay, so it's not a tone or a sentiment. Love is a motivation. Love is a motivation. Okay, if our motivation is love, then all those other things kind of I found tend to take care of themselves. And if our motivation is addressing the health of our congregation out of love, if that's the motivation, then I think that has a much better chance of being successful. I mean, what Ryan said about vitamin D, our own data showed over 80% of the hospitalizations in our country for COVID were vitamin D deficient. That also lines up with obesity. Why? Because vitamin D, as Ryan can tell you, is a fat-soluble vitamin, which is why people that are obese or overweight almost always tend to be vitamin D deficient, okay? Because their body's having a hard time absorbing the proper amount, or they're not outside enough in the sun being active enough to get it the old-fashioned natural way, And so these are simple things that would have saved a lot more lives than divisively buying into the talking points of the spirit of the age. I mean, when I read Tim Keller was segregating his church by vaccine status, I just frankly threw up in my mouth. I mean, if he wants to do something for people, hand them all 8,000 IUs of vitamin D every dang Sunday when they come to church. That'll do a lot more for them than that. Okay. I mean, so that gets to, are we really trying to help people, or are we sending virtue signals to the state? Hey, I'm down with whatever, I'll simp for whatever directions you guys give us. And the question that you're asking here at the end is a revealer of that. Are we really here to help people? Or are we really here to show the government we're helpful to them?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Hopefully this, we'd like to think this is all going away. We're not going to revisit this, but it seems like maybe that won't be the case. And the next time something comes around, and God forbid it's more virulent than even what we experienced here, hopefully the fact of the matter won't be that the church is actually more obese and unhealthy than the unhealthy culture in which it's in, which what limited studies have been done reveal. But instead, making the target on our back even bigger, and the rationale for shutting down and masking up and separating and all the rest, all the greater. Hopefully, when this comes around, we can look and say, you know what? We're less likely to get sick, not only because we've investigated the facts of the matter and we're trying to determine for ourselves what's true and what's not, but we also are healthier than the culture at large, and we have less to be fearful about, and all the more to gather and be bold about and to affirm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time and your expertise that you're bringing to this. And I hope that as well as being a challenge, I'm sure it may offend some, but hopefully it will be a challenge to some thinking, and hopefully it will be encouraging to others, as this will not likely be the last time the church will be confronted with something to try to limit its effectiveness and limit the reach of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.